The snow was falling thickly, like an endless blanket covering everything around it. In the white expanse of the Montana mountains, the small wooden cabin stood against the gale, its walls creaking under the impact of the cutting winds. Inside, Jonathan, a man with a tired expression and calloused hands, stood hunched over the fireplace, listening to the crackling of the flames. The warmth and silence had been his only company for years, and he had grown accustomed to it. But tonight, something different would break his isolation. A muffled noise emerged from the storm, almost swallowed up by the fierce sound of the wind. Jonathan frowned and raised his head, his senses heightened by the solitary instinct he had developed over the years. At first he thought it was just a twig, breaking under the weight of the snow, but then again a firm impact, reverberating against the wood of the door, as if something or someone was trying to get in. His chest tightened. Who could be there? Montana didn't usually receive unexpected visitors, especially in the middle of a deadly storm. He hesitated before standing up, reaching for the oil lantern hanging near the fireplace. His breathing was low and controlled, but his muscles were tense, ready to react at the slightest sign of danger. The last time someone had knocked on his door, it was a long time ago, and that visitor had never returned. Jonathan walked slowly to the cabin's entrance. Each step made the boards creak beneath his heavy boots. Still undecided, he put a hand on the latch but didn't turn it. Instead, he pressed his ear against the cold wood. Nothing, just wind. Had he imagined it? He pushed the thought away and exhaled slowly, until another thud hit the door with more force. This time something was very clear. It wasn't the wind with a firm movement. He unlocked the door and opened it just enough to peek out. The cold invaded the cabin like a sharp blade, making his skin crawl under his thick coat. His flashlight swung in his hand, as it illuminated the white expanse outside. At first he saw only snow swirling in the air, but then its light revealed something enormous. Standing there motionless in front of him, Jonathan held his breath. Golden eyes gleamed in the darkness. It was a grizzly bear, but not just any bear. It was covered in caked snow, shivering slightly and breathing irregularly. It didn't roar, it didn't lunge. It didn't show any signs of aggression. Jonathan had seen bears in these mountains before, but never like this, never. Would a bear brave a storm of this magnitude? To approach a human nature never worked that way, and yet there it was, staring, unwavering, carrying something unsettling. A request. Jonathan stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The grizzly bear, imposing and majestic, looked out of place, standing in the doorway of his cabin. But there was something else, a vulnerability he would never have associated with such a powerful creature. The bear was clearly injured and exhausted, its paws shaking under the weight of its own body. The wind howled around it, blowing snow into Jonathan's face, but he couldn't look away from the bear's eyes. They were deep-set, filled with a silent pain, and a pleading that he couldn't ignore. Against all his instincts for self-preservation, Jonathan felt a surge of compassion. He knew that if he didn't do something, the bear wouldn't survive the night. Carefully, Jonathan opened the door a little wider, creating an opening, just wide enough for the bear to squeeze through. He backed away slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the beast, prepared for any sudden movement. The bear hesitated for a moment, as if considering its decision, before taking an uncertain step into the cabin. The warmth of the fire seemed to draw the animal forward, and it took a few more steps, leaving a trail of melted snow on the wooden floor. Jonathan watched every movement, his mind torn between fear and determination to help. He knew he was risking his life, but something stronger was driving him. The bear settled down near the fireplace, letting out a long, heavy sigh, its eyes slowly closing. Jonathan grabbed a blanket and, with extreme caution, approached to cover part of the bear's body, trying to provide a little more warmth. As the bear rested, Jonathan could see its injuries more clearly. There were deep cuts on its paws and bite marks, probably from a recent fight. He grabbed his first aid kit and began to treat the wounds as best he could. Every touch was meticulously careful, and the bear, surprisingly, did not react with aggression, only with a slight shiver of pain. Jonathan felt an unexpected connection grow between them. He had never imagined himself caring for a wild bear, but here he was offering help to a creature that somehow seemed to understand his intent. In that moment, the line between man and beast dissolved, leaving only two beings, struggling against the cold and loneliness. Jonathan watched the bear, sleeping by the fireplace intently. The animal's breathing was heavy and irregular, but the warmth seemed to be helping. He knew he had to act quickly, to treat the bear's wounds. Before it was too late, with shaking hands, he grabbed the first aid kit and knelt beside the beast. His heart pounding, every movement was calculated, every touch gentle. Jonathan cleaned the deep cuts on the bear's paws, applying antibiotic ointment and covering them with gauze. The bear groaned softly but didn't move. Jonathan knew he was risking his life. One wrong move and the bear might attack him. But something inside him told him the animal understood his intent. It was a delicate dance between trust and survival. As he worked, Jonathan couldn't help but reflect on his own life. He, too, was hurting not physically, but emotionally. The loss of his family had left him isolated, living in seclusion. The bear's unexpected arrival brought to the surface feelings he thought he had buried forever. The need to care, to protect, to connect. It was as if the bear was there not just to be saved, but to save Jonathan from his own loneliness. With the wounds treated, Jonathan stood and watched the bear for a moment. He grabbed an extra blanket and carefully placed it over the animal. Trying to provide more comfort, the bear sighed deeply as if silently thanking him. Jonathan moved away and sat in a nearby chair. Keeping vigil, the night would be long, but he was determined not to leave the bear alone. Time passed slowly. Jonathan watched the bear, lost in thought. He wondered what had brought the animal to his door. Was it just survival instinct? Or was there something deeper? An inexplicable connection between them. The idea that the bear could sense his own pain and loneliness seemed absurd. But he couldn't shake the thought. In that moment, Jonathan realized he was changing. The act of caring for the bear was bringing out a part of himself that he had forgotten finally. Exhaustion began to take over Jonathan. He curled up in his chair, keeping an eye on the sleeping bear. The warmth of the fireplace and the animal's presence brought him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. As his eyes closed, he whispered a silent promise. He would do everything he could to help the bear recover, and perhaps in the process, he would find a way to heal himself too. The night wore on slowly, each minute marked by the steady crackling of the fireplace. Jonathan lay awake, watching the bear sleeping beside him. The warmth of the fire seemed to penetrate not only the animal's body, but also the emotional barriers that Jonathan had built up over the years. There was something deeply soothing about this unusual scene. As the bear slept, Jonathan allowed himself to relax a little more. He remembered the stories his grandmother had told him about the bond between humans and animals, stories that he had always considered to be nothing more than myths. But now, having experienced this, he began to question his own beliefs. Perhaps there was a truth hidden in those ancient tales. The bear shifted slightly. Letting out a soft groan, Jonathan leaned forward, concerned, but soon realized that the animal was simply adjusting its position. He wondered what the bear was dreaming, if bears dreamed at all. The idea of sharing such an intimate space with a wild creature was surreal, yet incredibly natural at the same time. Jonathan picked up a book that was on the table next to him and began to read aloud. It was an old habit that he had abandoned, but he felt it might bring some comfort to both him and the bear. The words flowed softly, filling the space with a soothing calm. Jonathan's voice was low and calm, almost like a lullaby as he read. Jonathan felt a growing connection with the bear. He knew that in some way, this encounter was changing both of them. The bear was recovering physically, but Jonathan was healing emotionally. Every word read, every breath shared, seemed to strengthen the bond between them. It was as if they were both finding new purpose. The night passed quickly, and soon, the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the cabin. Jonathan closed the book and leaned back in his chair, feeling a peace he had not experienced in a long time. The bear was still sleeping, now breathing more calmly and regularly. Jonathan knew that their journey was just beginning, but for the first time in a long time, he felt prepared to face whatever came. Morning arrived with soft sunlight, reflecting off the freshly fallen snow. Jonathan woke to the first rays of sunlight and stretched in his chair. The bear was still sleeping near the fireplace, his breathing now more calm and regular. Jonathan stood stretching his tense muscles and approached the animal to check its injuries. It seemed to be recovering well. As Jonathan prepared a simple meal, he heard a soft sound coming from the bear. He turned and saw that the creature was awake, watching him with watchful eyes. Jonathan approached slowly, speaking in a calm, comforting tone. "Good morning, big guy. How are you feeling?" The bear didn't answer, of course, but his eyes seemed to understand. There was a quiet intelligence there. Suddenly, the bear began to move. Trying to get up, Jonathan took a step back, worried that the animal might hurt itself. But to his surprise, the bear managed to stand. Albeit with difficulty, it looked at Jonathan and with a slow, deliberate movement began to walk towards the door. Jonathan frowned, confused. What was he trying to do? The bear stopped at the door, looked at Jonathan and let out a low, almost growling sound. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, but something about the urgency of the bear's behavior made him decide to follow. He pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed his hat and gloves and opened the door. Letting the bear out, the cold wind hit them immediately. But the bear seemed determined. Jonathan had no idea what was waiting outside. They trudged through the snow, the bear in front, Jonathan close behind. The terrain was treacherous, with deep snow and hidden ice, but the bear seemed to know exactly where it was going. Jonathan struggled to keep up, his mind full of questions. Why was the bear so determined to lead him out? What did it want to show him? After what seemed like an eternity, they came to a clearing. The bear stopped and looked around, as if searching for something. Jonathan watched closely, sensing the tension in the air. There was something important here, something the bear needed him to see. He just hoped he was prepared for whatever came next. The clearing was shrouded in an almost eerie silence, broken only by the soft sound of falling snow. Jonathan looked around, trying to figure out what the bear was trying to tell him. The animal, in turn, seemed restless, sniffing the air and staring at the dense forest ahead. Jonathan felt a shiver run down his spine. Something important was about to happen. The bear began walking again, this time toward the forest. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, but the animal's determination convinced him to follow. They entered the woods, where tall trees blocked most of the sunlight, creating a dark and mysterious environment. The path was difficult with deep snow and low-hanging branches that made it difficult to pass. Jonathan wondered what could be so urgent. As they walked, Jonathan noticed signs of a struggle. Broken branches, claw marks on the trees, and bloodstains in the snow. His heart raced. The bear had been in a recent battle, and the urgency in its movements suggested that something or someone was still in danger. He walked on in silence, his senses on high alert. The bear stopped suddenly, sniffing the air more intently. Jonathan moved closer, trying to see what was ahead. Then he heard a faint sound, barely audible but unmistakable. It was a moan, a sound of suffering. Jonathan felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew they were close to discovering something important. They followed the sound to a small cave, hidden among the rocks. The bear entered first, with Jonathan close behind. The scene he found inside the cave left him speechless. Two bear cubs, shivering from the cold and visibly weak, were huddled in a corner, their large, frightened eyes fixed on Jonathan, who felt a surge of compassion and urgency. Jonathan knelt beside the cubs, feeling their rapid, shallow breathing. He looked up at the adult bear, who was watching him intently, as if waiting for him to know what to do. The responsibility he felt was overwhelming. He knew he had to act quickly to save these little creatures. What he did next could mean the difference between life and death. For them, the cave was small and dark, protected from the bitter wind outside. Jonathan looked at the bear cubs, shivering with cold and weakness. He knew he had to act quickly. With gentle hands, he picked up one of the cubs, feeling its small, fragile body against his. The other cub cowed even tighter, frightened. Jonathan whispered soft words, trying to calm it. The adult bear watched every move, its eyes filled with concern and hope. Jonathan realized that this bear was not just a random visitor. It was a mother desperate to save her cubs. The bond between them was palpable, an unbreakable bond of love and protection. Jonathan's heart sank as he realized the depth of this mother's sacrifice. Gently, Jonathan picked up the second cub, holding them tightly to his chest to keep them warm. He knew he had to get them back to the cabin, where they could recover safely. "Come on, Mother Bear," he said softly, looking down at the mother bear. "Let's save your babies." The mother bear seemed to understand, following close behind as he left the cave. The walk back was slow and difficult. Jonathan could feel the weight of the cubs in his arms, but his determination to save these tiny lives gave him strength. The mother bear walked alongside, her eyes never leaving the cubs. The cold wind whipped at their faces, but they kept going, driven by a greater purpose. Finally, they reached the cabin. Jonathan opened the door and stepped inside. Feeling the comforting warmth of the fire, he placed the cubs close to the hearth, covering them with blankets to keep them warm. The mother bear walked in close behind, watching intently as Jonathan cared for her babies. She seemed to trust him completely, a trust he did not take lightly. Jonathan prepared some warm milk and began feeding the cubs. They drank greedily, their tiny lives gaining strength with each sip. The mother bear watched, her eyes full of gratitude. Jonathan felt a rush of emotion as he realized he was making a difference. He was saving lives and, in the process, rediscovering his own humanity. As the cubs settled in, Jonathan looked at the mother bear. "They're going to be okay," he said, his voice filled with determination. The mother bear seemed to understand, her eyes filled with quiet relief. Jonathan knew there was still a long way to go, but together they could overcome any challenge. Their journey was just beginning. Jonathan watched the bear cubs, sleeping near the fireplace. They looked so small and vulnerable, but they were already showing signs of recovery. The mother bear lay next to them, her watchful eyes never leaving her babies. Jonathan knew he had an important decision to make. He couldn't leave the mother and cubs to face the wilderness alone. He got up and began to prepare more warm milk for the cubs. As he worked, his mind was full of thoughts. He knew that caring for a family of bears was no easy task, but at the same time, he felt a deep responsibility for the lives that now depended on him. Jonathan looked at the mother bear and saw the trust in her eyes. He couldn't let her down after feeding the cubs. Jonathan sat down next to the mother bear. "I will take care of you," he said softly. "I will do everything I can to make sure you stay safe and healthy." The mother bear seemed to understand, her eyes filled with quiet relief. Jonathan knew he was taking on a big responsibility, but he was determined to do whatever it took. The next few days were filled with hard work and dedication. Jonathan cared for the cubs, feeding them and keeping them warm. He also tended to the mother bear's wounds, applying ointment and changing her bandages regularly. The routine was exhausting, but Jonathan didn't mind. He felt a new energy and purpose in his life. As the cubs gained strength, Jonathan began to think about the future. He knew he couldn't keep the bears in the cabin forever. They needed to get back to the wild where they belonged. But he also knew he needed to make sure they were strong, enough to survive on their own. Jonathan decided he would spend the next few weeks preparing them. For that moment, Jonathan began taking the cubs and the mother bear outside, allowing them to get used to their natural surroundings. Again, he watched them as they explored the area around the cabin, making sure they were safe. Each day he saw the progress they were making. The cubs were growing stronger and more confident, and the mother bear was recovering well. Jonathan knew he was on the right track. As he watched the bears play in the snow, Jonathan felt a rush of emotion. He had made a choice that would change his life forever. He had found a new purpose and a new connection with nature. Jonathan knew that when the time came to say goodbye, it would be difficult, but he also knew he was doing the right thing. He was helping to save a family, and in the process he was saving himself. Days turned into weeks. As Jonathan cared for the cubs and the mother bear, the routine of feeding, treating injuries, and making sure everyone was warm brought new structure to his life. He felt more alive and motivated than at any time since the loss of his family. The presence of the bears brought new hope. Jonathan spent hours watching the cubs play. Near the cabin, they were growing stronger every day, their play more vigorous and confident. The mother bear, now recovered, was also more active, exploring the surroundings with her cubs. Jonathan felt a deep joy in watching their progress. One morning as he made coffee, Jonathan looked at the mother bear and her cubs and realized how much they had changed. They were no longer the fragile beings he had found in the cave. They were becoming independent, ready to face the world on their own. Jonathan knew the time to let them go was approaching, and it filled him with a mixture of pride and sadness. Jonathan began preparing the bears for life. Outside the cabin, he took them on longer walks in the woods. Teaching the cubs how to find food and protect themselves each day was a new lesson. a preparation for the future. Jonathan knew that when the time came, they would be ready to return to the wild. He was determined to make sure they had all the tools they needed to survive. As they spent more time in the woods, Jonathan began to feel an even deeper connection to nature. He realized that he was not only helping the bears recover, he was also healing himself. The outdoors, the fresh air, the sounds of the animals around him, all of it brought a new perspective to his life. Jonathan felt a peace he had not experienced in a long time. Finally, the day arrived. Jonathan knew it was time to let the bears go back to the wild. He took them to a safe area in the woods, where they could settle and thrive. Saying goodbye was difficult, but Jonathan knew he was doing the right thing. He watched as the mother bear and her cubs walked away, feeling a mixture of sadness and fulfillment. He had found a new purpose, and in helping the bears he had rediscovered himself. The day was bright and cold, as Jonathan prepared to take the bears back to the wild. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but now that he was here his heart sank. He knew he was doing the right thing. But saying goodbye would be hard. He looked at the mother bear and her cubs, who were ready to leave. Jonathan led the bears through the forest, leading them to a safe, secluded area where they could settle down. The path was familiar, but this time it had a different meaning. Each step brought them closer to freedom, and Jonathan felt a mixture of pride and sadness. He knew the bears were ready, but saying goodbye would not be easy. They reached a sunny clearing, surrounded by tall trees and protected from the strong winds. Jonathan knew this was the perfect place for them. He knelt down and looked at the cubs, who looked curious and excited. The mother bear stood beside them, her eyes fixed on Jonathan. There was a silent understanding between them. Jonathan knew it was time to let them go. "You're going to be okay here," Jonathan said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're strong and brave, I believe in you." The cubs seemed to understand, their eyes shining with determination. The mother bear approached Jonathan, and for a moment he felt as if she were thanking him. Jonathan stood feeling a rush of emotion. Jonathan stepped back, watching as the bears explored the clearing. They were home in the wild where they belonged. He knew he had done everything he could to prepare them for this moment. The mother bear looked at him one last time, her eyes full of gratitude and understanding. Jonathan nodded, feeling a deep and lasting connection. As the bears walked away, Jonathan felt a mixture of sadness and fulfillment. He had found a new purpose in his life, and in helping the bears he had rediscovered himself. He knew their journey was just beginning, but he also knew that he would always be with them. In spirit, Jonathan turned and began walking back to his cabin, feeling a sense of peace he had not experienced in a long time. The forest was quiet as Jonathan walked, but he knew he was no longer alone. He had found a new family, a new connection to nature, and in doing so, he had found a new reason to live. Jonathan smiled, feeling the cool breeze on his face. He knew the future was uncertain, but he was ready to face it, his heart filled with hope and gratitude. Jonathan returned to his cabin, feeling an emptiness he hadn't felt in a long time. The bear's absence was palpable, but he knew he had done the right thing. They were where they belonged, and he had fulfilled his mission. He sat by the fire, lost in thought, reflecting on the journey he had shared with these magnificent beings. The next few days were lonely, but Jonathan felt an inner peace he had not experienced in a long time. He continued his routine, but now with a new purpose and a new outlook on life. The connection he had formed with the bears had changed something inside him, bringing a new understanding of nature and himself. He knew he would never forget that experience. Then one morning, as he was chopping wood outside the cabin, Jonathan heard a familiar sound. He stopped and looked around, his heart beating faster. It was a soft growl coming from the forest. Jonathan put down his axe and walked toward the sound. Feeling a mixture of hope and anxiety, he knew who was there as he approached the clearing. Jonathan saw the mother bear, standing at the edge of the forest. Watching him, her cubs were beside her, now stronger and healthier than ever. Jonathan felt a rush of emotion. At the sight of the family reunited, the mother bear took a step forward, her eyes fixed on Jonathan, as if she wanted to say something. Jonathan approached slowly, stopping at a safe distance. He looked into the mother bear's eyes and felt a deep, silent understanding. "I missed you too," he said softly, his voice choked with emotion. The cubs played around them, Oblivious to the depth of the moment, Jonathan knew this visit was a gesture of gratitude, a final goodbye. The mother bear stepped a little closer, keeping her eyes fixed on Jonathan. He reached out, not touching, but simply to show his intention. There was an undeniable connection between them, a bridge of trust and respect. After a few moments, the mother bear turned and began walking back into the forest, her cubs following close behind. Jonathan watched as they disappeared into the trees, feeling a mixture of sadness and joy. Jonathan stood in the clearing for a long time, reflecting on everything that had happened. He knew he would never see that family of bears again, but the experience had changed his life forever. He returned to the cabin feeling stronger and more connected to the world around him. Jonathan knew that by helping the bears, he had found a new purpose and a new reason to live. Jonathan sat at the wooden table in his cabin, a notebook open in front of him. The soft morning light illuminated the room, creating a peaceful and inspiring atmosphere. He picked up a pen and stared at the blank page. It had been a long time since he had written, but he felt it was time to tell his story. He knew that the words he put on paper would be a testament to his journey of healing and redemption. He began to write about the day he encountered the bear in the storm. Describing every detail with precision and emotion, the words flowed easily, as if they were waiting to be released. Jonathan wrote about his initial fear, the compassion he felt, and the decision to help. He described the connection he formed with the mother bear and her cubs, and how the experience changed his life forever. As he wrote, Jonathan felt a sense of relief and release. Each word was a part of his healing, a way of processing everything that had happened. He wrote about the final goodbye, the unexpected visit, and the sense of peace he felt when he saw the bears. Healthy and happy, Jonathan knew that the story was not just about the bears, but also about himself and his journey back to life. Jonathan spent hours writing, lost in his memories and emotions. He knew that this story needed to be told, not just for himself, but for anyone who could find hope and inspiration in it. He wanted his experience to show that, even in the most difficult circumstances, there was always a chance for redemption and healing. Jonathan felt a new determination rise within him. When he finished writing, Jonathan closed the notebook and looked at the fireplace. He felt a sense of accomplishment and peace. The story was complete, but his journey was just beginning. Jonathan knew that he had found a new purpose. In his life, he decided that he would share his story with the world, hoping that it might inspire others to find their own strength and courage. Jonathan stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the forest that now seemed more alive and full of promise. He knew that the connection he had formed with the bears was special, but he also knew that there were many more stories waiting to be lived. Jonathan smiled, feeling a new hope and determination. He was ready to face the future with a heart full of gratitude and a mind open to new possibilities.